Thanks for joining us on CBS News Colorado for your First Alert Avalanche Forecast. I'm your First Alert meteorologist, Callie Zanandri. While the weather pattern is calm and dry, avalanche danger is still a concern in parts of the mountains. Joining me to break down what backcountry travelers need to know is Brian Lazar, the Deputy Director from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. Thanks for being here, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're seeing quiet weather through the weekend with high pressure building in, but that doesn't necessarily mean safer conditions in the backcountry.
No, not necessarily. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but despite our historically low snowpack, it doesn't mean we're completely safe from avalanches. And let me show you how that looks as we vary across the state. So here's our homepage map. As we move towards the weekend, you can see that the central mountains and the far western mountains, from the Elkhead Mountains down through the Flat Tops and the Grand Mesa, are all sitting at low danger or generally safe avalanche conditions, while we've got most of the central and northern mountains sitting at moderate avalanche danger. And what's driving that danger varies a little bit depending on where you are in the state. So our first flavor of avalanche are these persistent slab avalanches, which has been with us since we started to build our snowpack in November. And you can see the most dangerous slopes remain near and above tree line on slopes that face north, the whole east side of the compass, and even south-facing slopes with the recent wind-drifted snow from northerly winds. And that is most pronounced now in this northern part of the state, where we're seeing more slab avalanches. And then we're seeing more of this loose, dry avalanche problem in the central mountains, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But here's what these wind-drifted slopes look like. And so it's the wind that is really driving where these persistent slab avalanches are running. And so we have weak layers everywhere, but what we need for these avalanches, like this one near Fremont Pass, is for wind-drifted snow. So here's a good example. Right below ridgeline, we've got wind-drifted snow. We had little bits of snow earlier in the week that did drift onto these same suspect slopes. And you can see the crowns here are breaking 1 to 2 feet deep on old weak layers that formed during our January drought. And you can see that some of these are starting to now propagate and connect terrain features and certainly pile up enough snow to be dangerous.
Now, where are you most concerned about someone triggering a large avalanche right now?
Yeah, Mother Nature is giving us a clear pattern. So if we look at this avalanche that was triggered up near Vail Pass, you can see some riders that were traveling in thin, rocky areas, in this case below the slope, pulling out this slab avalanche. And so what we're seeing in the pattern of these slab avalanches is that people are triggering them from not only those wind-drifted areas, but they're triggering them from these thin, rocky areas.
Now in that photo, Brian, I noticed there's lots of tracks on the slope, but tracks on the slopes doesn't necessarily mean it's safe for riders.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to drive home, particularly with this kind of avalanche, these, running on persistent weak layers. Tracks on the slope does not mean it's safe. It just means that people have avoided those wrong trigger spots. So here's a really good example. You can see this one up near the Eisenhower Tunnel. There's a track already in place right down the gut. This skier gets close, hits a thin rocky area, and pulls out a slab. And fortunately, the slab released below their skis, and so they were not caught or swept up. But you can see they were very close to a pre-existing track, and yet they were still able to trigger an avalanche. Again, here's another one up near Vail Pass. This person kind of on the right-hand side skied their way through these thin rocky areas without triggering one. The second rider in hit a thin rocky area next to these rock outcrops and pulled out the persistent slab avalanche. So again, you can see these wind-loaded terrain features. It's these smooth pillows of snow, which is obvious in hindsight in this photo, but these are exactly the kind of terrain features we want to avoid. They're wind loaded, as you can see by the smooth sculpted surface, and there's lots of rocks poking through, which means there's lots of potential trigger points. Here's another one from near Fremont Pass, and you can see just to the left here, not enough slab. As you certainly move out into the open slopes, you hit the thin rocky areas and boom, you get the avalanche to occur. Here's one more, a fairly large avalanche up near Steamboat, but you can see these things are now starting to entrain enough debris to be a real concern for people, certainly enough debris to bury, injure, or kill a person.
And Brian, there's a second flavor of avalanche you're concerned about heading into the weekend.
Yeah, and this has been developing over the course of essentially our entire dry spell, so over the course of weeks. But when you let our snow sit out under these cold, clear nights, it will weaken through a process that's called faceting. And what that does is create that weak, sugary snow that you can't really make a snowball out of. If you were to walk around on your feet or your skis, you're kind of walking on the ground. There's really no support. And you can see that these are happening most pronounced on the north side of the compass at lower elevations. They're happening at lower elevations because those are more sheltered, so they don't have those stiffer wind-drifted slabs as widespread across the terrain. And they're shaded, which means that it accelerates that faceting process or leads to all of this weak snow. They've generally been on the small size, as you can see here, but in the central mountains, particularly in the Elks and through the Swatch Range, these are now growing large enough in continuously steep, long-running terrain to hit size 2 and the biggest terrain features, and even size 1s can be a real threat if you're above creeks, cliffs, and other kind of terrain traps. And here's what these look like. So you can see it's all just weak snow. These aren't plates or slabs of snow break loose out of the snow surface, but once these get going, if you're on slopes 35 degrees or steeper with a continuous pitch and several hundred feet or more vertical relief, you can get swept off your feet and washed into potentially obstacles. So here's another one out near Aspen, triggered up near here in the trees, and you can see that this loose slough ran right into the trees. Unfortunately, this person was able to ski out of it before getting swept up. But these are becoming a threat, and that is now what's driving the danger in those central mountains are the threat from loose, dry avalanches and all this weak snow. They're much easier to trigger. They're generally small, but they're going to be more widespread than these persistent slab avalanche problems in this portion of the state. And then lastly, we have had some warm temperatures. We saw a small uptick in loose, wet avalanche activity. It's always going to come out of these sunny slopes, steep, rocky terrain. This problem should ease as we move into the weekend and we get a return of some cooler temperatures. But if you're lower elevations in really rocky terrain that's getting sun-drenched, you want to watch for roller balls, wet, loose, slushy surface conditions more than about boot top high. And at that point, it's time to exit avalanche terrain or move to colder, shadier slopes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brian, and we will see you back here next week for your First Alert Avalanche Report. And if you have a story idea in the mountains, send your tip to your reporter in the high country, Spencer Wilson. He lives in Summit County. You can call him at 863-TIPS or email him at yourreporter@cbs.com.